Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Courtaulds. I'm delighted to welcome Sara James as our speaker tonight. Sara is Professor of Visual Culture at Manchester School of Art, Manchester Metropolitan University. I first met Sara here at Courtaulds, well, not here at Vernon Square, but down at Somerset House in the early 2000s. We were starting our PhDs together, and as we sat through various inductions, there was a description of how some PhD researchers could organise public events. Sara leaned over to me and whispered, "We should do something together."
Only not in that voice.
This led to a slightly eccentric symposium called Theory as an Object, which some people here helped bring to fruition, and a friendship that has lasted over 20 years. Since that first meeting, I've been constantly impressed by Sara's tenacity, her fierce drive, and seemingly boundless energy. She's full of ideas and has a deep commitment to thinking through the forms, politics, and infrastructures of various art worlds. Her work on post-war German art and photography has been widely influential, but she also embraces numerous other contexts, engaging in contemporary art practices, the politics of the art world, higher education, and art. She's a prolific writer, writing art criticism for a number of journals and magazines, including many feature articles for Art Monthly. She's published 2 monographs, Common Ground, German Photographic Cultures Across the Iron Curtain, which was published by Yale in 2013, and looked at photographic practices across East and West Germany, pulling together well-known photographers such as the Beckers with underappreciated figures from the 1950s to the 1980s. In 2022, she published this beautiful book, Paper Revolutions, An Invisible Avant-Garde, with MIT Press, which looks at experimental art practices in the former East Germany, focused on ephemeral works and artists operating in lively networks and communities that change how we conceptualize East German art from the period. Somehow, alongside this scholarship, Sara's also managed to curate a number of exhibitions. As Senior Curator at Tate Liverpool, she curated the 2022 Turner Prize, and she also co-curated the research-led exhibition Anti-Social Art with Professor Sara Blaylock, a group show at the Tweed Museum in Minnesota on experimental art practices in Germany. So today's seminar presentation is taken from her new research project, exploring eco-socialism and art in an age of disaster. It has the wonderful title of 3 Atomic Fairytales from the former East Germany, an ultraviolet art history of Afterlives. So we can all welcome Sara.
Thank you for that very, very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me. And it's so nice to see so many faces, students and colleagues from former art historical lives in London. Okay, so it's always a pleasure to be back at the Courtauld, and my talk this evening is, as Catherine said, titled, can everyone hear me at the back? Not too accurate. Cool. Okay. It's titled 3 Radioactive Fairytales from the former East Germany, an ultraviolet art history of afterlives. And although it takes up ideas plotted in my last monograph, Paper Revolutions, it's really, as Catherine said, the beginning of a long work in progress, which will lead hopefully to my 3rd monograph on art in disaster. So with that in mind, I welcome any feedback, comments, reflections, or, because we're at the Courtauld, critical interrogations, looking at Sara Wilson. And I just wanted to begin by saying my talk this evening will have 2 parts. So the first offers 3 brief reflections, or what I'm calling radioactive fairy tales, orbiting the atomic Marxisms of Walter Benjamin, Bertolt Brecht, and Ernst Bloch, each of which grapples in distinct ways with how to register the aesthetic, ontological, and political shifts wrought by radioactivity. Part 2 turns to 3 nuclear sites in the former East Germany and their image worlds, which in turn complicate, extend, and undo these atomic Marxisms. The intention is then that part 1 illuminates part 2, and vice versa, revealing hidden details, like ultraviolet light makes photoluminescent substances fluoresce, and both put pressure on the normative historiographies and temporal architectures of art history. So, on to part 1. This is to keep you all awake, yellow and purple, also pretty close. 3 3 radioactive fairy tales. Number 1, Walter Benjamin's Spectrums of Ultraviolet Knowledge. Writing about a project by the German artist Susanna Freeman, Library for Radioactive Afterlife, of 2016, investigating the literal and political invisibility of radioactivity from uranium-rich mineral pitchblende mined in the former East Germany's Ore Mountains, scholar of Marxist political aesthetics, Esther Leslie, tells a sad story beautifully, a semi-fiction housed in critical theory. When he fled the Nazis in 1933, Benjamin left Germany carrying only one suitcase, which contained very little. And one of the things it contained was an X-ray of his own chest, diagnosing heart failure. Leslie tells us how fascinating Benjamin was with the estranging perspectives of the X-ray, cast in a photographic language we were yet to be familiar with, of ionizing radiation, microwaves, and photons, originating from the electron cloud of an atom. He was captivated by the strange light of phosphorescence, light that decays, occupying the edges of the spectrum, ultraviolet and infrared, radiation that couldn't be seen by human eyes, but could on photographs. Kriemann's autoradiographs, photograms produced by exposing light-sensitive paper to radioactive specimens, are also windows to radical kinds of ultraviolet and infrared knowledge, where cultural praxis and products have afterlives and knowledge can be comprehended in the form of lightning flashes, recurring, mutating, like radiation, not necessarily ever decipherable as a whole, but gradually permeating our horizon of understanding, confounding internal and external perspectives, and collapsing the linear narratives of post-Enlightenment, human-centric time. Radio autographs, as they were first termed when used by the US Army's nuclear scientists, or so-called Geiger men, in the 40s, during the atomic weapons testing programs that largely took place in Nevada and the Marshall Islands, served a less allegorical purpose. They enabled the Geiger men to gauge radioactive contamination and nuclear decay in the region's ocean and its marine life. Kriemann appropriated these eerie images of irradiated bodies of birds and frogs and fish, and they joined multiple East German specimens in her virtual library, exposing the catastrophic effects of atomic tests on flora and fauna. What, these autoradiographs asked the Benjaminian in me, would an art historical methodology attuned to this image world look like? Number 2, Bertolt Brecht, registering the fallout. In the wake of the unprecedented deaths caused by the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, immediately killing 226,000 Japanese civilians, injuring hundreds of thousands, and sentencing unknown numbers to future deaths from cancers mutating across generations, Benjamin's close friend and comrade, Brecht, retooled his play, Life of Galileo, written as an interrogation of dogma versus scientific evidence, despotic regimes versus intellectual freedom. Brecht had first developed the play in 1938, having fled the Nazis and exiled in Denmark. There he'd engaged deeply with the local news of experiments unfolding at Niels Bohr's lab, where quantum physicists were attempting to split the atom, influencing Brecht's casting of science as revolutionary insight. Brecht returned to Galileo whilst in California, where he found himself from 1941, working in Hollywood, not far from the Los Alamos nuclear test sites. Describing the rupture that took place after Hiroshima, Brecht wrote, to quote, "The atomic age made its debut in the middle of our work. Overnight, the biography of the founder of a new system of physics read differently. The register and politics of Brecht's play and the sympathetic portrayal of its main protagonist were immediately altered in light of the catastrophic human failure which had culminated in the destruction of civilian life to an unprecedented scale." Brecht's Brecht's revised Cold War Galileo premiered in California in 1947. 3 months later, Brecht would endure a 3-hour interrogation before the House of Un-American Activities in Washington, D.C., accused of writing a number of revolutionary plays and poems. Cleared of charges, Brecht made his home in socialist East Germany the following year in 1948, whilst the USA became home to the grotesque spectacle of atomic tourism, which perversely flourished in the 50s in the aftermath of the mass death wrought by the bomb. Brecht's plays and poems were always at their core designed for future retooling, continually renewing their political charge by relating to their new political presence as they stretched from the rise of fascism to the global Cold War. But the shift registered by Galileo was different, more totalizing and stark. The bomb had transformed the world and made it strange, like the lunar pockmarked surfaces of the Nevada atomic testing sites, which had prepared the ground for the horrors unleashed on Japan. In Brecht's new play, science was no longer the liberator of an irrational world, but an irresponsible traitor. The Renaissance physicist mutated into Robert Oppenheimer, Death, the destroyer of worlds. Catastrophically, Brecht never saw the realization of his new nuclear Galileo, which opened in East Berlin in 1957. He died of suspected coronary thrombosis whilst rehearsing for the play the year before. Would an X-ray or electrocardiogram like the one Benjamin fled with have warned him? Brecht's atomic Marxism asks us to see critical and visual practices as similarly strategically embodying the possibilities for their own futural remakings, attendant to historicification, alienation, and epic pedagogies, artworks as time machines, perpetually travelling back to the future. Our atomic fairy tale number 3, Ernst Bloch's speculative materialism, cosmic time, and its blind spots. Following Apollo 11's mission in July 1969, the team of astronauts returned to Earth with the first moon rock samples. The German mineralogist and geologist Wolf von Engelhardt, a professor in Tübingen, was one of the few experts outside of the USA to receive the selection. The rocks, which he personally couriered back from Houston to Germany, were given their own police escort from Stuttgart Airport, ferried with blue flashing lights and sirens. Among those who knocked on the scientists' door to see the lunar crystals was the Marxist utopian philosopher of fairytales, Ernst Bloch, having fled East Germany where he'd lived since 1949, when the Berlin Wall was erected in 1961, to set up home in the West German University city. And he'd only left to give a lecture, so it's a lesson for us all. Bloch touched the rocks with great reverence, and, according to his partner, the brilliant architect and writer Carola Bloch, to quote, he refrained from washing his hands for days afterwards. What magical radiation did Bloch think the stones had emitted, and how had it so contaminated his fingers? Bloch's optimistic magnum opus, the 3-volume Principle of Hope, had just been published in East Germany in 1954, 55, and 58, and had proffered a model of speculative materialism far from the cultural pessimism dominating West German neo-Marxist thought. For Bloch, the radical category of the not yet was all that was latent and anticipatory within the human subject, anchored in a radical reconciliation of the human race and the natural world. He likely brought this futural imaginary to his encounter with the moon rocks. Much has been made of the ways in which the photographs of Earth taken from the Apollo mission had a transformative impact on the way the planet and its resources were understood. From Buckminster Fuller to Stuart Brown's Hold Earth, attempts to picture new perspectives and models of consciousness. But what did these little rocks change for Bloch? The lunar stones buzzed with ancient time, with the magic non-human afterlife of a supernova. their atoms packed with the monumental stories of radiation. The ruptures the stones performed for Bloch were chronopolitical. They held within them the potential to transform knowledge of the universe. If the story of the solar system's early development had been erased on Earth, it remained frozen in the face of the moon, in rocks 4.19 billion years old. In his essay, The Anxiety of the Engineer, written 40 years earlier in 1929, about the fear which accompanies technological invention, and touching on the example of the refrigerator, which, as it happened, relied heavily on radiation and radon, Bloch had dwelled on the connections between magic, technology, things, and anxiety. For Bloch, the more advanced the technology, the more magical it became, intersecting, to quote, with the realm of taboo, with mists and vapours, unearthly velocity, golem robots and bolts of lightning. Cinema of the 1920s, for example, had appeared to enable visions which in the popular imagination had been reserved for sorcerers or witches. For Bloch, then, science was not an alternative to magic, but actually its fulfillment and destiny. His speculative materialism and concept of non-synchronicity confounded linear narratives of post-Enlightenment progress and claimed multiple temporalities out of kilter within any one historical period, dwelling on the differences between human versus cosmic or geological time, as well as looking to non-Western temporalities. Bloch argued for a plurality of times. For example, time in music, work time, historical time, as well as the non-contemporaneous nature of social formations, nations, geographic regions, classes, institutional logics, all of which could produce or block emancipation and lead to revolutionary discontinuities. Perversely, given Bloch's sensitivity to cosmic time, he failed profoundly when it came to his naive approach to atomic energy. He wrote in The Principle of Hope that Western capitalism had not pushed the peaceful atom far enough, proclaiming, to quote, "A few hundred pounds of uranium and thorium are enough to make the Sahara and Gobi Desert disappear and transform Siberia, northern Canada, Greenland, and the Antarctic into the Riviera." Frightening in light of Trump's recent proclamations. Bloch's words, monstrously prophetic of our own present climate emergency, seemed to suppress all anxieties of the engineer in favour of what appeared to be magic and the socialist uses it might be put to. In the 20s and 30s, radiation had appeared full of utopian promises, so much so that bathing in radioactive water and inhaling radon was viewed as a miracle cure for multiple ailments, with radioactive spas particularly popular across Germany. In the 50s, perversely, the production of plutonium and the supposedly clean energy it enabled was sold by both socialist and capitalist state as a radical form of pacifism under the ideology of atoms for peace. Coordinated by the US Information Agency, according to secret intelligence memos, it was conceived as the ideal psychological warfare and, quite possibly, the largest single propaganda campaign ever conducted by the American government, the objective of which was nuclear numbing, with the aim of nuclearism, the acceptance of nuclear weapons into everyday life. Civil nuclear power was key to this strategy, and popular culture played its role, with theme parks, world fairs, films, books, TV, and the culture industry deployed to normalize nuclearity. For example, Walt Disney's 1957 televised animated film, Our Friend the Atom, cast the atomic bomb in similarly magical terms to Bloch, as a genie in a bottle. After Hiroshima and with the Cold War nuclear complex in full swing, Bloch's continued alignment with this vision then appeared lacking in non-synchronicity and darkly misgiven. With Disney, the fairy tale had gone from utopian to reactionary. The year the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, the Soviets tested their own thermonuclear hydrogen Tsar bomb. I love that it was called the Tsar bomb, a bit of creative license. the largest nuclear weapon constructed. The detonation, over 1,570 times more powerful than the combined bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The global civil nuclear power industry then grew out of the atomic bomb programs, the first nuclear power stations built to provide fissile material for weapons. From 1945, more than 2,000 nuclear test explosions were conducted around the world, yielding a force equal to 29,000 Hiroshimas, poisoning soil, air and water and destroying ecosystems for post-human timeframes, leading to epidemics and cancers, swathes of land remaining radioactive for millions of years in a nuclear colonialism which strategically destroyed indigenous lands from the Native Americans of the Shoshone to the Kakapa Nation in Australia and the communities of the Marshall Islands. One of Bloch's close collaborators and friends, the philosopher, journalist, activist, first husband of Hannah Arendt, second cousin of Benjamin, Gunther Anders, dedicated his book, The View from the Moon, of 1970, to Bloch. But it was no homage, more a pointed critique to a comrade. Less well known than Brand and Buckminster Fuller, Anders' thesis was also written after the Earthrise photos. But unlike theirs, Anders' thesis was ardently Marxist. His critique of the capitalist and colonial nature of space travel cast a catastrophic light on the nuclear age, arguing that the abstract sublime of space only accelerated the self-destructive drive of humanity. He called for global resistance and action, and condemned Bloch's optimistic commitment to hope after Hiroshima, and his utopian category of the not yet obsolete in light of the omnipotent threat of nuclear apocalypse. Anders' astute prophetic diagnosis has been noted by Jonathan Crary, who writes in his brilliant Scorched Earth that, to quote, "What distinguishes Anders' position is his insistence that nuclear weapons have become the paradigmatic technological object. For their absolute efficiency, for their perpetual disclosure of their irrelevance and disposability of living things, and for their utter remoteness from any claims on behalf of a human or natural world." Anders' thesis on how the telos of modern technological culture entailed installing a world without us, Crary rightly stresses, did not simply mean the disappearance of people, but rather the encroachment of autonomous technological systems that render obsolete any decision-making on the needs of human communities, a present condition we find ourselves in with 24/7 information capitalism, smartphones, and the internet complex. So, despite its blind spots, we might ask, what is retrievable in Bloch's speculative materialism and non-synchronous cosmic time for our present interrogations of nuclearity? And can he still contribute to an ultraviolet cultural history of afterlives? Clearly, the atomic age wrought transformative, ontological, epistemological, existential, and ecological ruptures across the globe. Its promises and nightmares were registered, processed, and interrogated by aesthetic, visual, and linguistic means in theatre, poetry, literature, film, and art. To properly situate such post-atomic praxis requires then undertaking a kind of art historical world attuned to the cosmic and geological unhuman time of radioactive half-lives and post-nuclear world-making, or unworlding, as Anders puts it. One reaching for the ultraviolet knowledge Benjamin conjured up by the X-ray, the magic futural time stored in radioactive rocks treasured by Bloch, whilst aware of the blind spots of such speculative materialism, and attendant to the need for the kind of militant ruptures and futural retoolings materialized by Brecht. However, the nuclear age also engendered new and particularly unexpected sites of artistic production in the former East Germany. And part 2 of my paper will now turn to 3 such sites. Site 1, a nuclear state within a state, emerged in the clandestine Soviet-led uranium mining company Vismut, founded in the East German ore mountains in 1946, and codenamed after the harmless mineral bismuth as a decoy, Bismut's mines and towns spread to Runeberg and other areas of Thuringia in the south of the German Democratic Republic, and it was singularly responsible for secretly powering the Soviet nuclear arms program, producing 234,000 tons of uranium, enough for 32,000 Hiroshima bombs. Bismut made the GDR the world's third largest producer of uranium during the Cold War and the largest in the former Eastern Bloc, operating in the 40s apparently entirely undetected by American intelligence, soon joint-owned by the Soviets and employing 200,000 people. It was first located in the Ore Mountains, the same site chemist Heinrich Klaproth discovered uranium back in 1789. An area famous in the 19th century for its radioactive springs and spas. The ore was initially extracted via forced labour camps and sent to the USSR as reparations. Bismut's peak uranium production, though, occurred in the mid-60s to the early 70s, reaching 7,000 tonnes per year. To compensate the miners for the dirty, dangerous radioactive work, Bismut offered high salaries and better stocked shops than the rest of the GDR. To counteract the toxic nature of its industry and attract the vast workforce required, it built new towns around its mines, furnished with cultural centres, such as the Sanatorium Falkenstein in Warmbad, which you see here in a semi-derelict state, that had its own cinemas, theatres, restaurants, and winter gardens. Aggressive uranium excavation across the region from colossal open-cast pits transformed the landscape into a strange, scarred moonscape of craters and radioactive slag heaps, with settlements in the way demolished, including the 800-year-old town of Oberschlema, which was torn down, inhabitants forcibly relocated in 1952. The growing network of subterranean tunnels caused subsistence and the collapse of whole villages. Yet there was not one single piece in the press about the polluting industry or the dangers of uranium mining published in the GDR of the 50s and 60s. Now I will talk about some art, because we are an art historical institution. In parallel to this environmental destruction and preempting the corporate greenwashing via art soon characteristic of the mega monopolies of extractive fossil capitalism in the West, Bismut became home from 1946 to the largest corporate art collection in East Germany. The collection, mostly new commissions by major East German artists, is rich, as one might imagine, in mining themes, and ironically, given Bismut's sole purpose was producing Soviet weapons, mainly celebrated the peaceful atom, including this vast mural by Werner Petzold, who fled to West Germany in 1983. Bismut saw the collection as part of the cultural education of the uranium miners. It ran galleries, workshops, and displayed artworks in the communal, public, and residential areas of their purpose-built towns. By the time the GDR collapsed, the collection totaled 4,600 works by 450 artists, including prints, drawings, paintings, photographs, sculptures, and assemblages, now held at the company's headquarters in Chemnitz, where exhibitions are also staged. Alongside celebratory works championing miners, many tell different stories, mapping the brutal impacts of uranium mining unsympathetically. Chimneys belch, workers file in claustrophobic queues. Forests of pylons, mining shafts, and towers dwarf old frame houses. Thus, the Soviets' nuclear race perversely facilitated and nurtured the production of a vast collection of contemporary art in the GDR, much of which had a critique of atomic energy at its core, a visual archive with the very counterintuitive objective of documenting and charting an otherwise invisible world. One of the artworks held in Bismut's staggering collection is Viktor Makiev's stark depiction of the uncanny pyramids formed of radioactive slag heaps that became synonymous with the region. The painting makes clear the extent to which Bismut had violently transformed the landscape of Thuringia and rendered it strange. About 395 million tons of radioactive waste formed 48 giant tailing heaps, ultimately contaminating an area of 3,700 hectares. Dumped in residential areas, these were a huge health hazard, and amazingly, due to shortages in East Germany, these radioactive materials were also used for building houses. Local residents in towns such as Crossen complained of hair loss, tiredness, and impotence attributed to radiation exposure, and the settlements in the area became known as the Tired Villages. In a poem from the volume Pitch and Blend, published in 2000, Lutz Seiler writes, to quote, "Mineshaft temples suddenly purple, spoil heap glow, rises out of the past with every look. The sides are changing, every blink is digging you a cave in time." Seiler, who grew up in a village brutally ravaged by uranium extraction, uses alliterative sounds to perform the whispering, sizzling, and crackling of invisible radioactivity. In his poetry, abject miners down their sorrows with schnapps sold by bismuth shops, branded as a medical cure for radiation. Children metamorphose into insects, and the author's father returns home with a Geiger counter heart. Similarly surreal, estranging, and provocative records of radioactive life are accessible in Bismuth's art collection, such as you see here, Axel Wunsch's dystopian pyramid with its twisting pipes and artificial architectures. Other commissioned works depict the tensions arising from forced labour and severe conditions, which resulted in the first major uprising in the GDR in 1951, often written out of official histories, when 3,000 miners and civilians stormed the police station and precinct in Zaatad and refused to return to the uranium mines. Another of Makiev's works appears as a meta-commentary on the perversity of making art in a uranium mine. The deep abyss of the mine is clogged with intestine-like piping, an easel housed in its midst reflecting back a blank, abstract white canvas. Perhaps the invisible lightning flash of radiation, or was the artist referencing the radical shifts in representational means required for radioactive times, in a grand refusal reminiscent of the stark abstraction of Malevich's Black Square? Surprisingly, many artists associated with the countercultural, alternative, and activist circles of the GDR were also commissioned and collected by Bismuth, such as Jürgen Schieferdecker and Dieter Kolker, whose work explored styles not officially condoned by the state, Dada, pop, and constructivism. Schieferdecker was a particularly counterintuitive addition. He produced many works explicitly critical of the nuclear arms race and atomic energy. He also hated Warhols. There's lots of anti-Andy Warhol works. Another was Michael Morgner, part of the art collective Clara Mosch. Founded in Karl-Marx-Stadt, now Chemnitz, the group was constantly under Stasi surveillance due to their radical, anti-social art. In Morgner's Three Figures of 1977, which you see here, black and white stylized bodies mirror the crisscross iron scaffolding of mine shafts and X-rays, with peculiar internal architectures revealed against a bright white that also illuminates the top corner of the aquatint, firing across the sky like a meteorite. Whether Morgner's prints self-consciously spoke to the invisible radiation and cancerous mutations breeding silently in the miners' insides, they can't not retrospectively evoke such symbolism. Radiation exposure was not even measured in the region until 1956, and the results kept secret for decades thereafter. In 2006, a study of 59,000 former bismuth miners showed a 70% increase in rates of lung cancer, leading to more than 7,000 radiation-induced deaths among those surveyed. But not just miners were affected. Unlike most other countries where uranium mining took place in sparsely populated areas, the south of East Germany was one of the GDR's most densely populated. There were too many radioactive accidents in the region to mention. Drinking and local drinking water supplies were frequently contaminated, and radioactive dust from the tailings scattered by winds. Silicosis and lung cancer became prevalent. In 1961, an accident near Crossen involving a concrete pipe breaking leaked 700,000 cubic meters of radioactive mud into the river, with contamination levels reaching 1,000 times the legal limit. The press coverage did not mention Bismuth's name or radioactivity. Another accident took place in 1984, when 120,000 cubic meters of wastewater containing 720 kilograms of uranium poured into the Elbe. Arsenic contamination and the poisoning of wildlife and birds as a result of Bismuth's emissions was also common across Saxony. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time with this artist now. Another artist in Bismuth's collection, Peter Sylvester, first trained as a chemical engineer, depicted the apocalyptic landscapes formed by the open-cast mines of the region by many hundreds of prints. Delta 2, 1970, which you see here, combines a monochromatic coloured aerial perspective so detailed it looks even microscopic, exposing the veins and ribbons of rock or the bird's-eye twists of a river and mountains taken from an aeroplane. A montaged and manipulated clipping of a planet in orbit, printed in black and white, similar to the Earthrise images, but familiar formations replaced with alien land masses and a flickering lightning storm covering the surface like a plasma ball. The film rebate emphasising the materiality and illusion of the camera's gaze, and a camera crosshair, which you can see at the bottom there in the centre, suggesting a militarised vision of colonisation and enemy targets. The very unnatural green bleed of the image is reminiscent of the unnatural emerald hues of several radioactive ores, and like the ghostly neon uranium glass, a craze from the mid-19th century that glowed under UV light. Sylvester's print holds several precarious perspectives in orbit, engaging with the mapping of different kinds of cosmic and geological time, in many ways akin to Bloch's utopian project of non-synchronicity. But Sylvester also pictures the dystopian post-human lifespan of nuclearity that Bloch had failed to, Anders' view from the moon, or Earth transformed into a radioactive globe. From 1968, the year of the first photographs from the moon, Sylvester started to produce cosmic landscapes, engaged with processes of emergence and decay. He said about this shift, to quote, "This is where my longing to move away from familiar landscapes to worlds that seem very alienating came together, to chaos landscapes where everything is in tremendous flux, where there is something threatening from above, but where one still senses nature in a small corner. Is this still a world of nature, or a world come, or a past world?" These new planetary perspectives are evident in titles such as Cosmic Landscapes and Other Worlds. Sylvester often began his works with classical etchings, breaking down the surfaces into facets. And look at some of them look like really cheesy sci-fi novel covers, which was particularly appealing. From 1976 onwards, he used a device, which I've never heard of, based on video technology, called the densitron, which had been developed to evaluate autoradiograms at the Central Institute for Isotope and Radiation Research at the Academy of Sciences in Leipzig. The technology made it possible to play with colours experimentally, long before image processing enabled by the personal computer. So although the majority of Sylvester's works foreground a post-human world of rock formations and ice ages, one stages the uneasy juxtaposition of people and landscape. In Mountain Variations of 1973, a blood-red stained collective of people march across the land, like refugees or nomads. At first it's unclear if they carry rifles or shepherd's staffs, appearing intent in their march to the horizon, where their forms merge into a mushroom cloud. I'm sure, given this gathering of art historians, particularly the Marxist ones among you, many of you will recognise the image. Come on. Looking at you, No? I was pleased to recognise the image, right? An iconic revolutionary march, Sylvester montage but reversed the famous image of the mass spectacle of the storming of the Winter Palace, staged in 1920 and later research staged for Sergei Eisenstein's 1927 movie, October. Sylvester's artwork then not only charts the ecological fallout of uranium mining from a post-anthropocentric perspective, depicting the sharp, chiselled, mutilated landscapes of a hostile planet under a nuclear winter, but also explicitly critiques the ecological fallout of the Russian revolutionary project, tracing the environmental apocalypse taking place in East Germany back to the Soviet nuclear arms program, seeing both beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution and ending potentially in dystopian annihilation. His choice of the iconic image, now mutated into a stain on revolutionary history, also spoke to the complexities of Soviet revolutionary time, first remade from the zero hour of 1917, but expanded, deconstructed, and reconstellated by constructivists and the filmic avant-garde, by its photographic, cinematic, and montage remakings. In Sylvester's print, then, revolutionary time meets nuclear time in a complex chronopolitical undoing of both. And it's hard to look at without Anders' Marxist eco-socialism in mind, particularly his 1959 essay, Apocalypse Without a Kingdom, within which Anders critiques the communist vision of history, which fails to extricate itself from a Christian and Enlightenment eschatology and temporality, and asks how emancipatory thinking that rejects such unilinear progress could now orient itself towards the future. Sylvester's eerie and crystallized landscapes imagined a radioactive future that we're still living in today and are far from living through. With the fall of the GDR, the Federal Republic of West Germany assumed ownership of Wismut in 1991. Yet before decommissioning its nuclear power stations, the post-socialist project of a newly reunified Germany benefited from the mining operations conducted in the East, which totaled about 40 tons of uranium a year from 1995 to 2000. Since then, the German government has approved a budget in excess of 6.4 billion euros to undertake the biggest cleanup operation in the history of uranium mining. Site 2, an atomic research centre and the alternative art scene. So our second site is as counterintuitive as the first. The new nuclear research industry of the GDR also staggeringly played a key role in supporting and fostering the unofficial, alternative and countercultural art scene of East Germany, the same once censored and persecuted by the Stasi. Amazingly, from 1969, Dresden's Rossendorfer Atomic Research Center became a significant locus of experimental art, with an informal program of regular exhibitions and arts happenings. Founded in 1956 and where the GDR's first core reactor was located, Rossendorfer remained the country's largest nuclear research institute. The German-born British physicist Klaus Fuchs, who took part in the Manhattan Project and acted as a spy for the Soviet Union, was deputy director there until 1974. Over the years, Rossendorfer hosted 43 art exhibitions, documented in a regular art zine, of the GDR's most significant unofficial artists of the 70s and 80s. The peculiar transformation of a nuclear research facility into a centre for underground art was facilitated by the physicist Manfred Deutscher and the chemist Eberhard Gebler, both champions of abstract art, the latter of whom opened an informal private gallery in the 70s in his apartment under Dresden's Hoffmannstrasse, and the physicist Reinhard Koch, who organised the Rossendorfer Club evenings, soon known as ROCH, which numbered about 112, and involved experimental open discussions and concerts by alternative artists, creating a key platform for the artistic neo-avant-garde in the GDR. Despite the rise of a militant environmentalist movement that opposed nuclear energy and weapons in East Germany by the 70s, some of the most prominent artists and thinkers associated with the alternative countercultural art scene enjoyed a strangely comfortable relationship with atomic energy at Rossendorfer, although some of the events took a critical stance on nuclear arms, as you see here in the Kunstgegengewerbe Art Against Violence Memorial Evening for Hiroshima. Many experimental artists whose careers were thwarted by the state, which championed socialist realism, had exhibitions as part of the programme, including the neo-constructivist Hermann Glöckner, who had exhibitions in 74 and 75. These often took place in the Nuclear Research Centre itself, in the meeting rooms, canteen and the foyer to the library. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given the artists involved, the happenings and exhibitions were closely monitored by the Stasi, under the codename Club, whose records note that hostile ideologies were taking root at the centre. One of the most significant underground artistic figures whose work could be celebrated at the Nuclear Research Centre was Carl Friedrich Claus. Often mistermed an outsider artist, the polymath whose practice spans sound art, concrete poetry, installations, sprawling textual drawings and printmaking, had an informal evening and exhibition dedicated to him at the Centre in February 1978. It focused on what he called his Sprachblätter, or talking sheets, inked works with tiny scripts and graphic elements performing complex text and image relations, many of them projections or maps into the future, intended to be complex, cognitive and discursive platforms to provoke their viewers into a slow and involved engagement with Marxist ideas, philosophical concepts and experiences. Like Sylvester's last work, the talking page you see here from the 60s imagines the long-distance effects of the October Revolution. Claus engaged in the most profound and decades-long dialogue with Ernst Bloch, which I do talk about in a chapter of Paper Revolutions, and his speculative materialism, buoyed by Bloch's claim that art, music, literature and poetry could work against a world dominated by capitalism, which he saw as producing rigidified, reified thought. Bloch's conception of the utopian imagination and non-synchronicity provided the conceptual apparatus of Claus's Sprachblätter, and he wrote and exchanged many letters with the philosopher, and in actual fact the philosopher's partner, Carola, for over a decade. Claus explored the magic time of geology in many of his artworks, fascinated as well by the agency of organic and natural forms within Bloch's philosophy. He noted in one letter to Bloch that plants could be thought of as having a kind of emotional life, or organic, latent, not yet conscious. Claus gifted a specially created artwork to Bloch on the occasion of his 80th birthday in 1970. Unaware of Bloch's very recent encounter with the lunar Apollo rocks, the artwork was incredibly titled Embryo View from Rock. It referenced the 16th century Swiss alchemist Paracelsus, whose vitalist natural philosophy, exploring the living spirit of organic matter, had much influenced Bloch. Significantly, Paracelsus was also the first German author to diagnose, in 1534, what became known as Schneeberg disease, the lung cancer caused by the accumulation of the uranium decay product, radon. However, throughout his decades of engagement with Bloch, Claus approached him via a simultaneous dialogue with a prominent East German novelist, Christa Wolf. If Wolf was herself indebted to Bloch, she also problematized his thinking, and her work offered Claus a complication of Bloch's speculative materialism via post-humanist, feminist eco-socialism and engagement with deep ecology. Wolf also emerged as a key correspondent, friend and supporter of Claus, who drew significantly from her novels, fiction and aesthetics. And indeed, it was Wolf's husband, the art critic Gerhard Wolf, who organised the Rossendorfer Atomic Centre event for Claus in 1978. The artistic culture orbiting Rossendorfer also spanned over a decade, and Claus remained engaged with it, curating an event in 1986 in honour of the futurist Ukrainian poet and artist Alexei Pushnik, whose famous avant-garde anti-opera Victory Over the Sun of 1913 staged an attempt to overthrow linear time and reason. The opera featured a cast in gas masks, a chorus singing the song of the anxious people, and a set involving the first versions of Malevich's Black Square. Pushnik's spoken poetry performance book, Universal War of 1916, also proffered a nihilistic yet pacifist Promethean vision of non-synchronicity that must have seemed relevant once more in Claus's Cold War world. Yet a few months after Claus's homage to Pushnik, with the meltdown of Chernobyl's fourth reactor, everything changed again, and this radical coming together of avant-gardist nihilism and the GDR's counterculture within the orbit of nuclear research took on a very different resonance. Christopher's semi-autobiographical novel, Accident, Today's News, in 1987, dealt with just this aftermath. It gives a stark and disturbing first-person account of the day she learned that the fourth reactor of Chernobyl had exploded whilst waiting for news of her brother's surgery to remove a brain tumour. Describing the totalising yet invisible nature of the change that occurred, Wolf writes that nature was no longer a pastoral Heimat, but a place of deadly and imperceptible radiation. Like Brecht, Wolf bears witness to the shock wrought by the disaster, a shock that reverberates at the level of language. The romantic symbolism of nature, pastoral, sublime, picturesque, collapses in on the realism and abstraction of the disaster, and she writes, to quote, "On a day about which I cannot write in the present tense, the cherry trees will have been in blossom. I will have avoided thinking exploded. The cherry blossom has exploded, although only 1 year earlier I'd not only think, but say it readily." Wolf goes on to describe the surreal cloud of radioactivity sweeping across much of Europe as a peculiar, paradoxical combination of weather and history. Post-Chernobyl in the late 80s and 90s, Klaus returned again and again to the subject of radiation in his art, producing nuclear sheets and masks, one of which was titled Radioactivity of the Brain, alongside a series encoded codes, alpha, gamma, beta, within which he appears to be mapping rays and atoms, using an eraser to take away negative spaces, hands with outstretched fingers, and what looked like atom bombs. Like Brecht and Wolf, Klaus was similarly coming to terms with fallout and how to register such a profound shift in human nature relations at the level of language and symbolism, whilst keeping hold of Bloch's utopian magic. Site 3. Anti-nuclear activism in the male, better active than radioactive. The same striking imagery of the pink blossom exploding after the fallout found in Wolf's prose is articulated with staggering similarity a decade earlier in a diptych titled Atomic Tree by the East Berlin-based artist Rudolf Weyfeld, produced in the mid-70s. This, our third site of radioactivity and the subject of my paper's brief conclusion, is not located in one concrete place or region, but in the form of thousands of postcards sent around the militant and globalized transnationalist activist mail art network, engaged in solidarity with social and environmental movements crossing the world from East Berlin to Chile, the USA, Japan, and the rest of Europe. Mail art enabled East German artists to evade the borders and binaries of the Cold War, as well as the censorship of the GDR, although postal art was frequently monitored, tampered with, and confiscated. This expanded post-studio site of artistic production engaged deeply with the new global anti-nuclear environmental protest movements, which emerged as one of the most significant dissident movements in the GDR, crossing the Berlin Wall and uniting a cause in East and West Germany. Wolf Weyfeld addressed the arms race and nuclear apocalypse in many of her typewriter artworks. In a series titled Victory Defeat, mocks the madness of the superpower standoff. Chalice-like motifs underscore the precarious balance between triumph and catastrophe, as well as the impossibility of any winner in a nuclear war, like an atomic holy grail. In 1986, marking the fallout of Chernobyl, Wolf Weyfeld sent out multiple postcards to artist collaborators in Japan, USA, Italy, and Denmark. A black and white montage photograph of a bleak scene of post-war rubble and dereliction, a large sign with the word radioactive adorning the wall in the foreground, reminiscent of those installed in areas across Germany contaminated by Chernobyl's radioactive cloud. As was central to mail art, the postcard was remade and returned to its sender by artists including Bernd Philippi, Brigitte Romandi, and Carsten Schmidt-Olsen. The Chilean artist Guillermo Deisler rubber-stamped response, a grid of violet bees, mapped the life of ecosystems post-nuclear apocalypse, seeing the fallout from the post-human perspective of a new insect kingdom. In the collapse between post-war rubble imagery and a call to arms for a future collectively fought for, reimagined across different geopolitical contexts, each with their own complex chronopolitics, Wolf Weyfeld and Deisler's anti-nuclear missives and the many fields, geographies, and histories their collaborative work negotiates, articulates something, I think, close to ultraviolet knowledge. Not an X-ray or an autoradiogram, postcard performs the same displacement of time. As American feminist theorist and physicist Karen Barad has written, to quote, "The particularity of nuclearity is that it has already colonized the far future. It radically scrambles, if not disassembles, the imperialist universalizing sequentiality of past, present, future. Time is out of joint. It is diffracted, broken apart, exploded, shattered in multiple directions." These three nuclear sites and their related image and thought worlds rendered invisible in the West during the Cold War, along with the radioactive Marxisms my paper opened with, offer, I hope, examples of elastic temporal imaginaries and mutating and radiating perspectives born of the strangeness of the nuclear age, both in sync and out of sync reading out of their own times into our futures. These can aid us in re-evaluating our present climate catastrophe and the limits and perversities of the Anthropocene. Within them we find models of militancy, utopia, dystopia and resistance, which, following Barad, are counterintuitively located in nuclearity itself, yet born to be mobilized against the nihilistic logic of nuclear capitalism today as it expands into space and we enter what appears to be a new kind of Cold War, an age of disaster. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. There was so much there. It feels like we've kind of got a mapping of a project that really crosses over a sort of broad sways of time and also sort of concepts. Whilst probably people are just kind of letting that settle, I wondered if I could ask you, like, what do you see is going to be the centre of this project? Because as you were speaking, you kind of move across the 20th century and obviously this kind of radioactive time that moves, you know, far, far into the future. And I was wondering, like, for you, is there kind of, you know, is it the kind of the sort of beginning of atomic bomb testing? Is that the kind of the centre of the project? Or how, like, where do you see its kind of heart sitting? And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you're seeing this mapping out as a bigger project.
So I suppose at the moment I'm kind of thinking about not necessarily the beginning of atomic testing. Maybe I keep on going back to the birth of fascism. So I've got another chapter thinking about after the flood, and the deluge as a kind of model that keeps on reappearing in Weimar as a sort of metaphor for fascism and capitalism. So it feels like after the flood, after the fallout, after the kind of future, these different sort of ways in which those moments map on, and I guess with ascendant fascisms all around present, that feels like that moment is so key. But I guess that I want to kind of think of actually some chapters beginning very much of contemporary art projects that are positioning themselves as kind of time machines, so that it's not something, I mean, I really want to write a book that isn't on East Germany as well. So I think that probably would key. It might be a bit of East Germany. I mean, this might end up being an article and not in the book. But I think there's so many interesting projects. You could take this into forensic architecture, Susan Shipley's kind of radioactive stuff. There's been loads of exhibitions on contemporary art and radioactivity. But I think there's something so interesting. It feels like a lot of projects are beginning to really look at the Cold War and the contemporary. And I think that sort of, you know, the madness of politics in our present moment, which isn't even kind of doublespeak and a pretense at kind of ideologies of democracy, is still kind of, is interesting for me to try and sort of plot that. So, yeah. And also staying with figures like, there have lots of people come across Gunther Anders before. Yeah, as in, so he was Stern and then Anders. I mean, just like really fascinating. And I think was so massively read in East and West Germany and hasn't really got as much attention within art history, I don't think, as some of the other thinkers associated with the Frank Festival. He played chess with Brecht in Hollywood. He was a cleaner in a Hollywood costume company and writing kind of novels, and it was just a really interesting kind of part of that puzzle, I think, and he developed a kind of negative anthropology. A lot of his work is still to be translated. There's some great scholars. Christopher Muller has done a lot of work. But I think that there is some incredible text there, and it's nice that he just suddenly starts to pop up a bit. So I was pleased when he appeared in Crary. But I think his writings are sort of an incredible means of kind of critiquing information capitalism and the current kind of flows.
Yeah, I haven't heard of his work before, so definitely.
It's fabulous, but he changed his name to Other. It's kind of cool. Like, he's kind of radical.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Because there's almost like another project of these kind of historical case studies, like the corporate art collection. I mean, that in itself, this has this really, you know, there's almost like a sort of second, much more kind of sort of detailed archival
And there's
projects.
a massive, totally. There's a big show because Chemnitz is the current capital of culture this year.
Okay.
Tweed in Manchester. So I'm trying to put on an exhibition on Klaus at Whitworth, actually, we're talking at the moment. But they've got a massive exhibition on this collection. But when I was researching it, I kept on thinking it was kind of like fiction, that I was sort of making it up. But I was like, even with Klaus, I sort of knew that he must have works on radioactivity. They'd not been published anywhere, but I was just sure that they were going to be there. And it's just this really funny thing where things emerged even when I wasn't necessarily sure they could.
Because, yeah, I mean, I would like to know a little bit more about that collection and who was curating it and how it was being gathered, because it does have a sort of a slightly phantasmatic quality to it, and I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about that, and then I'll open up for questions from you.
Yeah, I think it's just, that's one of the reasons why I go back to the DDR again and again, I guess, and maybe the Cold War, because it's always in the weirdest places, and so it's always in the spaces where you least expect to find something really radical and counter the kind of culture that you do. And that's the case even for like the underground art movements like Clara Mosh, and there's an amazing exhibition at the Chemnitz Kunstsammlung on Clara Mosh at the moment, just opened. They also had like, you know, lots of these countercultural art groups while being monitored by the Stasi were then revealed to have Stasi informants as their key members, and there's a sense that the Stasi were sort of almost kind of orchestrating a neo-avant-garde, or at least letting one foster, encouraging it too. So it just feels like that I like that fact that everything always flips. So it's how you can kind of think. The chronopolitical's got very trendy lately, I guess, and I'm just wondering what that means if we try and map it back onto that kind of argument, the Marxist kind of and Frankfurt School argument for non-synchronicity, and also when you really see that moment of neo-Marxist thought in West and East Germany is so absolutely attached to kind of not only experience of exile but also Cold War kind of German politics, and it's sort of fascinating.
And then feeding it through some sort of radioactive sense of the future as a kind of a apocalypse. Seems like
Maybe not an apocalypse, I don't know. I kind of think it's quite interesting that it's not entirely dystopian, but I think Anders is fascinating because he sort of argues for the fact that we have a kind of terrible dystopia in us naturally, a kind of alienation that we're always trying to overcome, or always trying to project a world. But I find his idea of unworlding quite a nice counter to the constant. There's quite a lot of talk for contemporary unworlding, which just seems a little bit trite and non-compelling.
Gonna undo it all.
If you unworld it, what happens? I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask if there's any questions from anyone? I'm sure there will be. At the front here.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Actually, I had a question which was, do you think there's any kind of, I mean, maybe the question is a bit fuzzy, but but I was wondering, do you think one can make a kind of distinction between the way that perhaps East German artists approach the radioactivity and perhaps West Germans or others? I mean, were they perhaps more in the dark about it, or were they, perhaps even more enlightened because they didn't have to, they had perhaps more access to it, or they worked in that area or something like that. So I just wondered if there were any kind of distinctions or any way you distinguish. And also I was wondering, you were talking just now about Stasi infiltrating lots of groups, and would they be, I mean, I think that, from reading about some of these people in Berlin especially, like it sounds like a lot of them were actually part of the movement as well. They weren't just Stasi.
Yeah, exactly.
Representing
There wasn't.
So it's only those two. And perhaps that also had an influence on the art, as opposed to West Germany where it was.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think maybe that kind of complicated double life thing is what's interested in the East. I don't think you could say that they were in the dark. I mean, there are also amazing examples of zines that were made on the pollution and uranium mining, kind of environmental movements, and because it wasn't in the mainstream press, and they really had a lot of exposure and accessibility. I mean, there were vast parts of East Germany who could get West German TV, so But I think what's interesting is it's always dependent on people in specific locations. So Dresden is completely different to East Berlin, is completely different to Leipzig, is completely different to Chemnitz. So I think you always have to kind of unpack it and complicate it. But yeah, it's kind of intriguing that whole project is not only a corporate art collection, but it kind of comes out of a government initiative to have artists in factories and on the ground and really kind of producing art that was supposed to be labour and be and be useful. So it's kind of like intriguing that maps onto kind of documenting a world that wasn't supposed to be seen. But yeah, it was a strange thing, I think, to be an East German artist, and each person you'd speak to has quite a different experience. I mean, some horrifically, treated at the hand, imprisoned for years. So yeah, I wouldn't want to generalise, but it is always a fascinating kind of space. It's how you kind of move and map from. I mean, there are certain projects that open up East Germany to the present, I think. But I do feel like, particularly a present situation where sort of the freedom of speech and the idea of what art is as a kind of social practice or as an anti-social practice, it feels like it's a kind of incredible resource to kind of go back to and look at those ideologies as they're given.
Thank you. There's a question right at the back there.
Making it work.
Yeah.
And heels.
Always stylish.
And in yellow.
Yes, coordinating for you.
It's both a sort of observation and a question at the end, I guess. So the works by Sylvester Klaus Woodfeld particularly caught me with the aerial shots and the maps. First I thought that was kind of appropriate, as those views concealed by it, like you can't, from that perspective. But also the photo montage as well. And it kind of reminded me of how, I'm definitely paraphrasing, but Benjamin talked about cities and towns being sort of glossed over by infrared knowledge in the same way that he talked about photographs containing a kind of glimpse of an alternative narrative or a phantasmic imaginary knowledge that you can only get a glimpse of a photograph. And I wondered if there were, if any, or that you know of, photographs from those towns and cities near the mines in the southeast from the time, or if there were any on the Czechoslovak side as well, near the border, and if you think that those could offer anything to the knowledge you're trying to produce it. Thanks.
No, I think that's really interesting. So the idea of like a kind of different archive or a counter archive or a kind of documentary archive of it. Yeah, no, I'm sure there are, absolutely. There are huge amounts of them. And actually Visma itself has a massive archive of documentary photographs, both of the environmental disasters and the transformation of the region, and now the German government, another archive of sort of post-reunification. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm kind of, it's sort of it's the fractured time within that mapping that's interesting to me, I think, in the examples that I chose. So although Klaus might look like he's kind of mapping, he's probably not really. They're not so much aerial, but they're really complicated, those pieces, because they're meant to be spoken as well. They're meant to be a kind of collaborative, performative space. So I guess it's about that, as a historian of photography, it's sort of just thinking of those different technologies of vision and the way in which they're embedded in so many different, sort of scopic regimes within modernity that you kind of can't get away from. But yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it gets very interesting in terms of the reproduction of those things as well in their own kind of worlds in which they travel. So the mail art was sort of sent everywhere. But say someone like Jürgen Schieferdecker, who's super interesting, was a professor of architecture, I think actually at the Tate Liverpool in Dresden, produced all kinds of interesting kind of portfolios and albums of different kinds of images. He does lots of mapping actually, and kind of weird. He does kind of, because he's an architect too, he has kind of town planning kind of, and these kind of graphic works and kind of combination of stuff. But what's really interesting is the kind of networks they made often, because they're limited edition prints and they're deliberately kind of gifted and given, but assembled in an album so that they're not bound, so that they evade censorship by the state because they're not understood as a publication if they're not bound. So they all have these like very interesting lives you can kind of map in that way. But yeah, it's an interesting one.
Thank you so much. I've got I have a quick question. You talked about networks and things and mail art. Were there any contacts with artists in Ukraine or Belarus or the Baltics with similar concerns during this period?
So yeah, I think definitely, and it's interesting that they're also artists. It's not only East German artists in the Bismarck archive. They do actually have lots of Soviet, Ukrainian artists there as well. And the networks are just, you know, massive in terms of Ruth Rayfeld and Robert Rayfeld, who kind of set up Contact and a whole network, a global network that they called Art Workers by Mail Art, would hold events and congresses and workshops and, you know, take visitors, mail artists from around the region and from the Eastern Bloc. So yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't find one after Chernobyl. I didn't find that she'd sent a picture, which is really difficult archive to use actually, because in terms of the creative political dimensions, it's kind of fascinating. She doesn't date anything. So Ruth Rayfeld was trained as an archivist, wasn't allowed to go to art school, was a typist and archivist at the Kunstakademie in Berlin, and sort of taught herself how to make typewriter art at the table, and spent her entire days, like, she archived their collection, so their global connection is really well kind of archived and carefully kind of annotated, but she refused to date any of her works, very deliberately, as a bit of a finger up at my kind of establishment, I guess. It's quite cool. So you can never, even that Chernobyl work, it was really hard to get her to, like, interviewing her several times to say, yeah, that was post Chernobyl. Was it made before then? Was it the sort of, because lots of her work does seem weirdly like she's prophesizing kind of future too. But it'd be really interesting to see if it made its way to Ukraine, that postcard. Yeah.
Is that the atomic tree?
Yeah,
I mean, that's a fascinating image.
Yeah, and
Thank you for a brilliant talk. It's such a huge amount of information that you've got across.
too much information, sorry.
I know, it's beautifully traded together. So I was going to ask you about the time thing, which I think anyone who's like working in this field has, like, because it's so boggling. I was wondering, because what was coming across me was that you were taking the lives of the artists as being a way, in a sense, to get over the problem that there's so many individual stories that you can throw in, and you do in class books at one point, which is like a massive, as you said,
And
like
Niels
a
Bohr,
fictional
actually,
story.
somebody should make a movie about him if they're not.
There's so many movies in there.
Lots
so-
of movies.
But what was coming across me was that you were like finding in the artists themselves a kind of a way of getting over that. I mean, was I perceiving something that you were thinking about, that the artist becomes the figure? Because I think for a lot of people, for the artists, it's the work that becomes the big link, and also because the way in which art archives itself, then it also crosses time and space. But I felt with you were looking at artists. Is that
Yeah, I mean, that book, The Big Yellow, was kind of trying to do exactly that. It was talking about artists' lived experience and social kind of relations, because a lot of the artists were autodidacts, so they didn't go to art schools, they didn't go to academies, and they were, you know, having exhibitions in their kitchens, organising exhibitions, self-publishing, self-archiving, sort of mobilising. So I guess the point that I make in the intro is that how do you get access to that without a really awful art history of intention, biography, and kind of, you know, storytelling? How does that become something that we can kind of transcribe? So I suppose that's kind of why I like all the funny little, you know, the sort of odd little events at the beginning, you know, that bind those characters together. They do become like characters in a Cold War play as well, though, which I kind of like, in that sense that maybe you can approach a work of art a little bit like a Brecht play that can be remade and retooled and rethought. And I was working on that, you know, the Catholic essay for the Brecht show at Raven Row, and kind of thinking about art as time travel and Brecht as a time traveling kind of Marxist, that made me really kind of think a bit more about those different remakings, like the politics that sort of play between them. But yeah, I think so. But at the same time, it's hard to. I mean, I guess that's what I'm trying to do a bit with the bringing in poetry and bringing in a novel and bringing in is also that this is an expanded field of practice that I'm kind of interested in. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to take those individual. And I guess their works become a bit like kind of portals and means of kind of crisscrossing backwards and forwards a little bit. But yeah, that's nice reading.
Thank you. Is that a question, Joanna?
Question. Thank you for such a brilliant and stimulating talk. I was wondering about drugs.
Well, I did want to write a book all about Germany, philosophy, fascism, and drugs, because it's pretty fascinating when you get there.
Yeah, I mean,
So tell me what you think.
I think I'm thinking as somebody looks at this period and these types of issues in the North American context, drugs are such a big part of how artists are encountering this threat and transforming it into an aesthetic experience. And when you speak of portals and expansion, I'm just wondering about the politics of experience, and also just you talked. I know so little about East Germany. I was just Googling right now how stringent, you know, drug policy was. My impression was that it was highly stringent, but considering the kind of complicity of the state with these countercultures, or the ways that they were being kind of operated or seeded, I'm just curious about the role of drugs, especially the Klaus drawings. They look vaguely psychedelic.
Yeah, they do.
And I'm also just thinking about the ways that LSD is being sourced, often from, if not East Germany, at least closer, and labs, the role of labs in your...
Which is really Cold War too.
Yeah, and just the types of research being done, and I can, you know, readily imagine psychedelics being part of this lab culture, or this countercultural lab, this intersection between science and art and countercultures, which is a different way than it's organized in the US, but actually kind of weirdly, very comparable, I think.
Yeah, it's very funny.
And of course you showed Stuart Brand, so that's all there.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that sort of space where the counterculture slips into Cold War surveillance is a really interesting one, whether or not, I think Klaus was genuinely high on block smoking. He didn't take any drugs.
Benjamin got high.
Benjamin was on hashish. Ernst Junger was taking LSD, massive coke head, his armoured kind of like, you could write in quite, I mean, all the Nazis actually pretty much doing crazy things. It was a populist book, I consider. Maybe I would be a much wealthier person today, maybe I would have been bestseller. But yeah, no, I think totally, like certainly that psychedelic experience is key to the way in which Benjamin is like exploring time and travel. So yeah, it would be really interesting. It probably has more legs to do that in the States, because you have got really definite scenes of artists kind of experimenting and documenting that kind of psychedelic experience. But yeah, I like it, and I'm sure East Berlin must have been a hub of pretty crazy experimentation.
And it's also just making me think about the ways that psychedelic experimentation was also fueled, sponsored, and operated by the CIA.
Exactly.
So it's like there's a similar kind of complicity, because I think there's an investment in rooting the counterculture towards lifestyle, towards drug experience, getting people high and dropping out, rather than actually being engaged in politics.
Yeah, you're collectivizing. No, it's really interesting. I like it.
Any other questions? Or maybe the mention of drugs means that we should move to having a drink next door. I'd like everyone who wishes to join us in the research forum just down the corridor to the right to have a drink, and you can ask Sarah many more questions informally. But before we do that, if we could just thank Sarah for a brilliant talk.